Imagine it's Sunday morning, you're preparing lunch, and you have to get some tomatoes for your salad. So you come down to your little backyard garden, and you pick your own homegrown, ripe on the vine tomatoes. If that sounds too good to be true, then I understand. But how about you join me in this video and let's talk about how we can make this fairy tale into reality, 100% organic, super simple, easy, affordable, and the best part, in containers. So no matter where you live, you can have this. Let's get going. Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining in. This is Heirloom from the Trini Gardener channel, and I'm so happy to be talking to you all about growing tomatoes today. Now, I do already have a tomato growing guide for containers and in ground. I'll link those videos up here, but I wanted to do an updated version, and I think I'll always, every time I feel like I need to do an update on these videos, simply because I follow you all and you all follow me on social media, TikTok and Facebook, Instagram. And I'm always getting a bunch of questions, and as much as I want to make a video that is reasonably long, don't want to bore you all to sleep, there's always going to be topics that come up, and when I see the questions and I see the comments, I'll do a video on it just to make sure that I cover all the bases so that we can all grow nice, big, juicy, sweet tomatoes in our home gardens. So let's get to it. Now, of course, if you are planning to grow your tomatoes in containers, I'll show you what I'm using for this tree that you're seeing here, which is a 5-gallon bucket, right? This is what we call a pigtail bucket in Trinidad, and this is 5 gallons. And this is what I'm using to produce this. Now, it doesn't have to be this size. I know this is not always like in high availability for everyone. And a lot of people just, you want to just take that first step and you want to try growing something. And that's completely fine because, I mean, not everyone has all the resources, to have a bunch of containers and to have land or to have soil and that kind of thing. So if you really just want to get your foot wet in growing tomato, I would suggest that you can use one of these containers here. This little ice cream container is a 1-gallon bucket. I have another 1-gallon bucket here. And believe it or not, you can grow tomatoes in a bucket like this. Now, you do have to manage your expectations. If you have a bucket this size, which is 5 gallons, and then you have a bucket this size, which is 1 gallon, then you just have to manage your expectations and just be aware that you're not going to get the exact same size a tomato tree. The amount of roots that you can get here is going to be 5 times the amount of root that you can get here, which means that the tree, maybe if it's not 5 times the size, it definitely will be a bigger tree if you use this container here. But that does not mean that you can't grow tomatoes in this and get a harvest. Not a massive harvest, could be a massive harvest, we never know, but you can get a harvest from it, and this is completely free. I mean, the price of the ice cream, or if you know someone who eats these kind of ice cream all the time, and you can grow your tomatoes in there. Just get your foot wet in it and, just get that little experience under your belt. And then, I mean, after you can graduate to a bucket like this, if you don't have one already available. And when you do graduate, then you'll see how much you want to invest in it. And then you can start getting and compiling your own containers for your container garden. So you can use any container that you are comfortable with. Just make sure that at the bottom of your container, you have drainage holes. Those drainage holes are very important, and do not neglect them. Put a lot. Sometimes I even plant in containers that don't even have a bottom part. I've broken it out, or it got broken out sometimes, maybe during some construction work. So, and I never worry about it, because once that soil compacts and the roots go through and you start to water that is going to stay right there in that container. It's not going to drop out. It's not going to be washed away to any extent that you need to be worried about. So definitely have your drainage holes, and that's going to make sure that you don't ever overwater your plants, because whatever water goes in, excess water is just going to flow out. Now, we're going to go over to the potting station, and I'm going to talk to you all about what I'm using to fill my containers and the type of seedling that we're going to be using for growing our tomatoes. Now, the tomatoes we're going to be planting in today is a hybrid tomato. This is called a 008 tomato, and this one here is an heirloom tomato. And before I plant the teen, I'm going to be planting in the hybrid. I want to talk to you all a bit about what is meant when we talk about a hybrid variety tomato or hybrid whatever, and an heirloom tomato or an heirloom plant. When you have a hybrid, you have a mixture of 2 or even more plants, and the purpose for hybridizing, right, the process of making hybrids, is to, like, just imagine you have a tomato that is really good at being huge, right, being big tomato, but let's just say that big tomato is really susceptible to a lot of diseases, and then you get another tomato that is really strong with resistant diseases, but it is a tomato that doesn't get very big. And now you want to create a tomato that is fairly big and also resistant to disease. So what you do is over the course of some years and doing your experiments, you can create a hybrid where you're going to get that size and you're going to get that resistance. That's how you get a hybrid tomato. And that's the reason why you create hybrids, right? To get the best of both worlds or the best of 3 or 4 worlds, all right? An heirloom tomato is not so much for performance as it is for the flavor, the taste of the tomato, and also the history of the tomato as well. If you get an heirloom, for instance, this is the moneymaker tomato, right? These are known for getting pretty big and producing quite a lot. Not massive tomatoes, but they're meant to produce quite a lot. And that's why you get a tomato like the moneymaker. Now, what the difference in the both tomatoes is going to be is that this flavor is going to be consistent, meaning that whichever tomato plant this came from, you are pretty much guaranteed that this plant is going to produce a harvest of tomatoes that is going to be identical to what the parent plant produced. A hybrid, however, if you were to find the parents of this hybrid here and you get the fruit from this plant, the chances of these tomatoes being exactly the same as the parents are very, very slim because the hybrid is, it's called stabilized and unstable. The hybrid is unstable in terms of the seeds. The plant is going to produce the produce that you want, but the seeds from this plant, if you were to save it, you wouldn't necessarily get the same type of tomatoes when you grow it out as you would have gotten from this plant here. Now, why am I going with a hybrid? I'm going with a hybrid specifically because I know we have some beginners with us, and you're going to be wanting a tomato plant that is going to produce, and that's what hybrids do. They produce. It may not be the most culturally exquisite tomato. It might not be the sweetest tomato, but you're going to get a good tomato that will produce for you and give you a good harvest. Now, when you get a bit more accustomed to growing tomatoes and you start getting some experience under your belt, then you can start trying to grow more heirloom tomatoes. These are, of course, as I said, very good for the flavor, very consistent, and you can be sure about the type of produce that you're going to get. The only thing about them is that you tend to not have all of the benefits of producing consistently well with diseases, and we have some issues sometimes with the heirlooms in terms of just their resistance. Doesn't have to be. It's just something that tends to happen with heirlooms more because an heirloom, it's really designed for the home garden and the home gardener. When when you go into a supermarket, there's a big chance you're not going to get heirloom tomatoes because the hybrids just are what we grow for numbers. And if you're thinking about, of course, in terms of the market, supermarket, you're thinking about money. If you want to make money, then you need to be consistent with your harvest and you need to make sure that you get the amount of numbers and the pounds that you need to get to make those shipments. And that's what hybrids are going to do. They may not be the best, super best tasting quality. They may not give you the history of the plant, but in terms of a supermarket, they don't really care about all of that. They just want to make sure that when there's tomatoes, there is always a consistent supply. All right. So that is our heirloom tomato and hybrid tomato. And we are going to be growing 008 tomato specifically because I find it to be a very good tasting hybrid tomato. Now, not saying like when I talked about the heirloom being, better in terms of taste and quality, that kind of thing, it doesn't mean that the hybrids are bad. I mean, for the most part, if you've just been shopping in supermarkets, you would have been buying hybrid tomatoes more than you know. All right. So it's not the end of the world. Most people eat hybrid tomatoes all the time and no one ever complains about it. Right. It's only when you get into the garden and then you start to see the difference between the hybrid and the heirloom. We are growing 008 because it's really good. I find it really good for tomato choker. It's really good as well for pasta sauce. If you want to make, your own tomato sauce, your tomato paste, it's really good for that. Italian food, right? To make your own ketchup as well. Amazing tomato. This is actually what I am filming next to when you see this video. So it's definitely a good tomato. It's definitely a good performer, and that's why we're going with this tomato here. And you would see it's in a cup, right? So I didn't get it in a cup when I bought it from the greenhouse. I paid 50 cents for this tomato. I think this one specifically I got it free. I bought like three, like I spent 150, and the purse I think I spent like $2, and they gave me like two extras. So this was an extra tomato that I had, and you get it as a small plug. And what I do is I put it into a container, a small container like this. It can be even a little bit bigger, and I bury it fairly deep. I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a few minutes. And I put it into this container so that the root structure, you can see that it didn't come with all this root structure. This root structure happened inside this container here. And what that does is that, so I can probably bring you over so you can see here. So this is the root structure that it came in. This is like the bit of the bulb of the soil that I got, right? If you can see here, and all of this is new roots. This is just as I got it home here, and I had it in this container probably for just about 7 to 8 days it's been in this, and you can see how much roots have already started forming on it, right? And what that does is that when you transplant a bigger plant with a bigger root structure, you have a lot more resistance to things like transplant shock. You have a bigger resistance to things like some pests that can attack the tomato when they're smaller, because they're just a bit more resistant because it's an older tomato as opposed to the little baby transplant that I would have bought for 50 cents at the greenhouse. And yes, that is the price that you should be paying at the greenhouse for a tomato seedling. If it's $1, fine. More than $1, like really why? There's no reason why it needs to be that expensive anyway in Trinidad for a tomato seedling, unless it's a special variety heirloom tomato. For a hybrid variety, definitely $1 maximum for these tomatoes here. Okay, so let's get planting. We'll talk a bit about my the growing medium, as well as how exactly we're going to be planting this in. So let's move over now properly to the potting up station. Okay, so this is the mix that I'm going to be using to fill my container to grow my tomatoes. This is a mixture of 3 types of soil. You have green waste compost in this, you have wood compost, and also some cow manure that has been cured for about going on 5 to 6 months at this point. Here from 4 months, your cow manure is safe to use. Some people use it before, but I like to make sure my cow manure is really well cured before I use it. Now, if you ever wonder what a good soil basically is or what it can do, is that firstly, of course, you want a soil that's rich in nutrition for your plants. It doesn't have to be. Some people use things like cocoa coir that has basically no nutrition at all, and then they put the fertilizer in it. So basically the cocoa coir is just a medium for the fertilizer that they end up using, mostly water soluble fertilizer. But that's not what we're doing here, especially when you're going 100% organic. You want a growing medium that is rich with the nutrition, but also has the ability of a good soil medium. So what is a good soil medium? It's very quickly something that can compress together, keep the form. That means that there's going to be good water retention. When you put a bit of pressure, it crumbles apart. So that means there's going to be good drainage. And that is more or less what you want, as well, of course, being full of organic matter. And that's what you can see here, a lot of humus, things that have been broken down. And if ever you want to even go further than that, you just go through the soil. So if you just take a little peek through the soil, you can see stuff like that there. See that worm, right? Don't know if you can find any. I know that grosses out some people, but life in the soil is a good indicator of how good that soil is. All right, if you have soil that doesn't have much life inside of it, then you have to ask the question, do you have good microbial activity going on in the soil itself? And those microorganisms are what we use to grow our plants. It's very important that that be present in our growing medium. In addition to the soil mix that we have here, I also put these very, very optional products into the soil itself. These are all organic, right? I'm going to start with this one here. Now it says tomato tone. Tomato tone doesn't really matter. There's also like garden tone, a few others in this chain here from Soma. I use this, there is some nutrition here, right? You can see there is the NPK. Remember I did the NPK, the fertilizer guide for you all. So I'll put a link up there for it, but basically the 3 stands for nitrogen, 4 stands for phosphorus, and the 6 stands for potassium, right? That's what we have in terms of the very basic nutrition here. And then you have some other things here, like you have calcium, remember, for the blossom and rot, and then you have some potash, magnesium, sulfur, that kind of thing. But I'm really more interested in what's going on here. These things are spores of bacteria, beneficial bacteria and fungi that basically helps with the microbial activity in the soil itself. These are basically small just organisms that will go attach themselves to the root of your tomato plant or any plant that you put them in, and they will help create a larger network of roots so that your plant can take up and be better with less moisture and even with less nutrition. Just having these microorganisms to use properly all the nutrition that you have in your grain mix, these will very well help your plants to grow. All right, so these organisms here, especially in an organic garden, we depend more on these organisms to do the actual work of growing our crops as nature intended than we do with flooding our plants with a bunch of just huge amounts of fertilizer that maybe the plant can even use because it doesn't have this microbial activity taking place here, which also helps to economize on the water consumption of your plant as well. So we're just going to get a handful of this fertilizer. Now, as I said, this is very optional because a lot of that microbial activity is already in the soil mix here, especially because of different types of compost. But it doesn't hurt to have it in here. It's $75 that you don't have to spend for it. But if you are able to, definitely go for it. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to put in is a little handful or two of this. This is worm castings, which is basically just manure from worms. Very good for nitrogen. 100% organic, natural ingredient, and of course having the worms in the mix itself is already going to help with the worm castings because the worms are just naturally going to poop into your soil, and that is going to very quickly break down and help feed your plants. Okay, so very beneficial. The next thing that I'm going to put, very optional. All of this is optional. It's not something that I do all the time, but as I have it, I think it's a good idea for you all to see it. This is garden gypsum, which helps with calcium specifically, right? So let's take like a bit of this here. Everything that you see in this container is the full one container of my for my tomatoes, a 5-gallon bucket, right? So just like one handful is more or less what I would put inside here, not a huge amount. And the very last thing, which again very optional, but I think you all should be aware of it, it's called azomite, right? This is rock dust. This is mined from a rock basically. I think it's like volcanic rock, and this is used specifically for trace minerals. Again, very optional, but if you do have the ability, I think for a bag like this that was up to here, I think I paid like $40 for it. So not a super expensive thing, but this will help with your trace minerals. So your tomatoes, like there's like 70 different minerals, trace minerals, things like magnesium, sulfur, even calcium, just like a bunch of different minerals that the azomite has as the rock dust, and that will help with the overall health of your tomatoes itself. All right, so for this, like I really don't measure anything at all. I'll just like sprinkle it around. Good, and there we go. So let's mix up all of this, fill it into our container, and we'll get to planting. Okay, so there we go, 5-gallon container all filled up. So we're just gonna dig a bit of a hole here. I never fill the container all the way to the top because I want to leave space for mulch as well as for subsequent topping up the soil that I'll talk to you all more about when we talk about fertilizer. Now you'll notice that I dig this hole fairly deep, right? You can see how much of my hand goes into here. Now I'm doing this one-handed, so I'm just going to try to be as gentle as I can with the seedling. Up. There we go. Right, take this out. Now why do I put the hole so deep? Now if you look with me here, you can see along the stem of this tomato that there are tiny hairs, right? Those hairs are just roots in dormancy, and as soon as these little hairs start getting in contact with the soil and moisture, they're going to spring roots. Like for instance, this is the root ball that I bought it with, right? This is what the tomato seedling came with, and all this was stem, right? I just put the roots around, and these little stems started to form all these roots around here. Now a good tip before you put in your plant is just to, not mash it up, but just kind of rough up a bit the roots just to get them out of being root bound and ready to start going into the container soil here. I'm going to put this fairly deep so you can see how deep I'm putting this here. So all of this is going to allow for a bigger, more robust root network, right? And of course, all of the extra things that I put in, which of course I did tell you are optional, but if you can't get them, they would not hurt at all. All of these microorganisms are going to help the plant start developing a good root structure so that it can be big and healthy and strong and produce really well for us. And there you go, tomato plant all planted in. You can see how little of it is actually above the surface and how much I buried. That is completely fine. The tomato plant is a vine. That's why you can do that with this. A lot of other vegetables, you can't actually plant them so deep because it'll cause root rot around the stem. But the good thing is that the tomato is a vine, so that it will still vine all along here, and even up until here you could have put it, and it really will not hurt the plant at all. It'll make it actually bigger and stronger and healthier. Okay, so very important, as soon as you transplant anything at all, you want to give it a good drink of water, right? This will avoid something called transplant shock, which is where a plant can just feel too out of sorts in the new environment, and that can cause the plant to just not grow properly, become dwarfed, have pests attack it because the plant is stressing out. All of those things, you can avoid that simply by watering your transplants as soon as you transplant them. All right, good. So you can see that the water is already starting to seep out a little bit at the bottom there. That's because the mix that we've put in is a mix that retains water. You don't want it to just drain out like that because that's just going to be wasting water, but it will retain water while allowing water to drain out, which is why you can see the water being sucked down slowly. This is a good mix for growing anything in a container. This is what you want. And the true last thing with the planting is that at the point of planting, because the tomato is a vine, you do want to stake it. And this is a determinate variety tomato, right? A lot of hybrids are, majority I think. So this is about a 4-foot PVC pipe. So as the tomato grows up, I'm just going to use a string and keep on tying it, right? And if if it needs like additional help to hold on to fruit, like if this is a bit wobbly, then I'll just use something else to prop it up. But I like to use these PVC pipes because we just happen to have a lot of it. So use what you have at home without having or forcing yourself to go out and spend money to get extra things that you don't really need. All right, the whole thing is to be self-sustainable, affordable, and of course organic. I know you all fed up with me at this point, but this is the true last step, which is I put a mulch to the top of the soil. The mulch is going to help retain moisture in the soil, avoid evaporation, and also avoid your organisms getting baked off by hot scorching sun that we have in Trinidad. I use a mixture of dry leaves and twigs. It's a lot better than any bagged mulch that you have, especially those with colors on it. That ink could be toxic, so it's better to use what you have at home. When it comes to how much sunlight you're going to be giving your tomatoes, I recommend a minimum of 8 hours of direct sunlight. That doesn't mean it can't grow with a little bit less. It's just that you're setting up your tomatoes to have to do an uphill battle if you're not giving it enough sunlight. These leaves, all these leaves, they are here for photosynthesis. They use sunlight, they convert that into energy, and that is what produces your fruit. If tomatoes, which is a sun-loving plant, it is a summer crop, doesn't have the amount of sunlight that it needs, this could cause different issues. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people have pest issues, because a lot of people come to me and they have, this problem, I don't know, blight or aphids and different types of pest issues. And, we attack the, the symptom. The symptom is that you maybe have a pest, but the actual root of the problem is that the pest is attacking your tomato plant because your tomato plant just doesn't have enough energy. It doesn't have the appropriate amount of sunlight for growing. And in Trinidad, we really do have that resource, which is that sunlight, which we take for granted all the time. I don't even consider it to be a bother, but for growing tomatoes, it is actually like gold to have that sunlight, because I'll tell you, there are people in temperate countries that wish they could have 12 months of sunlight like we have in Trinidad, and they don't. They work within a season of 8 months sometimes to grow all their tomatoes, and then everything else is either grown in greenhouses or imported, and we have the resource right here in Trinidad. So let's make the most use out of our sunlight. and give our tomatoes that amount and that availability of the sunlight, and not to put your tomatoes somewhere where it's shady, because even if it's like, you know, you consider inside your house there's light, right? That's not direct sunlight, and that's not what I mean by direct sunlight. Direct sunlight is like what I'm in right now. There's a bit of a cloud there, but you know, when the sun was out, you could see that the sun is shining directly on the tomatoes, and that is exactly what we want to have happen with our tomato plants. You know, they need that amount of sunlight, and I give it up to 10, 11, on some special days, 12 hours of sunlight, because they will not complain about the sunlight. They really want that extra amount of sunlight for that photosynthesis to produce the amount of fruit that we want them to produce, and to give them the best chance of that, but also to have that overall health by having that energy that they need from the sun. From the sunlight, we're going to go into watering, and my best piece of advice when it comes to watering is to listen to your plants. Listen to your tomato plant. Look at the way that it is, you know, behaving, and actually do a field test. Stick your finger down into the soil of your container and get an idea of what the plant is feeling in terms of that water. For instance, look at this tomato plant, the exact same tomato plant when it was lacking water, when it needed to get a drink of water. And you can see how the leaves are fairly thin. It's a little bit droopy. The plant looks kind of sad. And if you put your finger down, you're not going to get too much of moisture in there. It's not completely bone dry, and you don't ever want your plant to go completely bone dry. That's why I showed you the kind of mix with organic matter that we did when we were potting up our plants, because that's going to help retain the water. But you don't want your plants to ever go bone dry, because that's going to hurt your plants. Even if you don't see it now, it will do some kind of damage to your plant. So don't let it ever go bone dry. But still, without going bone dry, it can need water. And if it needs water, then you need to make sure that water is readily available for your tomato plant. You don't want to flood it. You don't want to have it like it's, you know, always waterlogged. That's why we put the drainage hose at the bottom of our container. Completely fine. But we want to make sure that our tomatoes never feel stressed by not having enough water, because if it doesn't have enough water, it's going to either start to drop fruit, or it can cause a problem that a lot of people link to lack of calcium, which is blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is where you have the tomato fruit forming and there's a bit of a black spot on there. And the majority of people I see talking about this on different forums, they, you know, chalk that up to a lack of calcium issue. And it is true to an extent that it is because of a lack of calcium, but it's deeper than that. It's hardly, like if you look at the studies, it's hardly ever that the soil doesn't have enough calcium. I mean, calcium is something that can be so readily available in soil, and it is something that is just, you don't need that very much of the calcium to produce that fruit without the blossom end rot. But if you have that calcium and you have irregular watering, then that is what is going to cause the blossom end rot. So it's not that your soil didn't have the calcium needed, it's that your plant didn't have the access to that calcium, which is in the soil. And how does it get access to it? It gets access to it by water, because that's how plants take up all their nutrients. Those membranes there, that's how the water passes, and then that's how the plant is able to suck up that water and take up those nutrients, and one of those nutrients being calcium. And you can put as much calcium as you want in the soil. If you have irregular watering, you're not watering your plants properly, or your plants are feeling, it's going dry, then you're not going to have access to that calcium, which is available. And then that's what's going to cause your blossom end rot, and maybe you might go buy more calcium, put it in the soil again, and you spend extra money when you just had to water your plants properly. And it's something that we take for granted, but don't ever take it for granted, especially with tomatoes, where, I mean, if you bite into tomato, it's, nice and juicy. That juice is water. You get that juice from water, and the plant needs to have that good, perfect, prime fruit that we want to be eaten. Where fertilizing is concerned, I talked to you all when we were doing the potting up that I use a rich growing medium, rich in organic matter, rich in nutrients, that's going to give our plants a good boost from the get-go. However, I do give my tomato plants a boost every 3 to 4 weeks, and that boost is just a mixture of soil that, completely organic, where I mix maybe some animal manure with some garden soil and maybe some worm castings or even some worm tea, right, which is where you use the worm castings and you make like a like a tea from it. You draw the worm castings and you water it, and that will go onto the surface of my plants there if we're talking about the mixture every 3 to 4 weeks, and I'll just water that in. So it's very popular now to use eggshells, crush them up and put them in a container and have that give you calcium in your container. The reality is a bit more complicated. The eggshells take a very long time to break down. I'm talking about a year to 2 years to 3 years for those eggshells to break down. And this tomato plant is going to be dead and gone from the time if we looked at when we planted it, the tomato plant would have taken probably 70 days. So that's just over 2 months, right? So putting the eggshells for calcium for a plant that's going to be long gone before the eggshells actually give me any calcium doesn't quite make sense. So the eggshell thing is a good idea, of course, but it's a little bit misplaced, a little bit misrepresented. The eggshells are not going to give your tomatoes calcium anytime soon. So the better thing to do with your eggshells, as I've talked about in my compost making video, which I'll put up here, put your eggshells in your compost pile and let that break down in the compost pile, so that when you use that compost, you're going to have eggshells in your soil. But don't put the eggshells directly for your tomatoes. It's just not. I know there's a lot of videos saying that it will. Do the research on your own, read the studies, and you will see that the eggshells, unless it's eggshells that's fully broken down and an eggshell that you have in your kitchen, it's going to take probably, sometimes years for that to break down. Even if you crush it up, even if you take a hammer, crush it up, or you take like some kind of grinder and grind it up, it's still going to take months and months for that to break down. It's not going to give you calcium to the extent that you think that it will, and not the time frame that you think that it will. So just manage your expectations with it. It's not a bad idea. It just needs to be represented a bit better in the forums that I've seen it in. And that's it for growing your nice homegrown 100% organic tomatoes. I know this was a long one, and congratulations if you made it to the end. Hopefully you didn't cheat and scroll across, but I really hope that this is going to encourage you to go out and try growing your own homegrown tomatoes in containers. And I hope that it's not just, something that you found entertaining, but something that you learn from, and that the information here is something that you're going to benefit from, so that when you do, take that leap and try growing your own tomatoes at home, you're going to have all the information. And feel free to come back to this video, and feel free to, of course, share this video with anybody who you think might be interested in growing their own 100% organic tomatoes right at home. Remember that you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and on Facebook, where you can see more pictures and videos of things coming out of the Trini Gardener's garden. And remember, as always, this has been Dylan from the Trini Gardener channel, reminding you to get up and get green. Take care.